But we're going to start with Sam, pronouns they, them. They are a theist and they want to talk about post death visitations and a shared death experience on a computer, which I find to be, I want more details on this. Sam, welcome to Skep Talk. How are you doing? And can you hear us?
Yes, I can, and I am doing all right.
Phenomenal. Tell me about this near, no, not a near death experience, a post death experience.
So, what I'm thinking about is, and the experience that particularly sticks out to me, I lost someone very close to me a few years ago, and there was, dreams that were very like feeling more real than real kind of feeling. And it was an experience of her visiting me and talking to me, and I could like very clearly in my head at least feel her and hear her. And then the shared death experiences part, that isn't something that I've experienced, but it's something I've been curious about that I've heard about is this idea of things like a hospice worker that remotely will like they'll get some feeling related to the person like that they've passed, and then shortly afterwards they get a phone call that the person passed, or they feel like the person is contacting them in some way directly after their death.
Yeah, I think those are super fascinating. I actually have had an experience like that myself, right? Where like I lost a loved one and then, a period of time that was like within the year later, I had this dream, where it's like I felt like they came to me in the dream and were like reassuring me that they were okay and things like that. And at the time, I found it super comforting. But like I look back on it at present and I try to find things about it that sort of distinguish it as what would effectively be a visitation as opposed to the sort of easiest explanation, which was I was sad and I was missing these people that I lost, and I had a dream about meeting them again, and I had a dream about something that I wanted very deeply, which is to hear that they were doing okay, wherever they were. And to me it's like it's very difficult looking back on that experience, on that dream, and what happened in that dream, and what the conversation that I had in that dream, and teasing apart elements that are unexplainable, right? Like it very much feels plausible from the perspective of like, yeah, my brain is kind of comforting itself. And I don't think that that's like less important. You know what I mean? Right. Because I feel like I got a lot out of that. It helped me kind of process the grief and cope with the loss in general. Which, if that is in fact what it was, just my brain kind of trying to rationalize and process this event that happened, might be the reason why that happens to people so frequently, right? It might
Mhm.
actually be a necessary step towards grief, like towards accomplishing your grief and like working through these issues for people in general, which may serve the reason as to why they're so common because they're important.
Yeah.
They're important for going through the grieving process.
Yeah, as Erica touched on, these are pretty common. I haven't experienced it myself personally, but I know that I don't remember the exact figures right now, but I know Bart Ehrman has talked about specifically. I've heard it from Bart Ehrman talk about how common these experiences are. Typically in dreams, but even outside of dreams, people report having experiences where either they're hearing deceased loved ones, seeing them, or even touching them, or both, or all three. So they are a common experience. And I like what Erica was describing too, that even if you can recognize that these things are being generated by your brain and are maybe not supernatural events, they can still be helpful in the way that we process grief and handle these emotions, so that there is still a benefit to it. And then what you were saying, with like people having these, what are you saying, like post death experiences, like these shared experiences, right? That was the second point that you were bringing up.
Yeah, like people that will remotely feel like the person that died is contacting them, and like they didn't
Right.
know that they had died yet. They hear directly afterwards, like, oh, it happened at that time, kind of thing.
I don't know what Erica thinks about this, but I have had maybe not the same thing with death, but sometimes, you'll be thinking about your friend and they'll call you on the phone or something like that, where it just seems like almost a game of statistics. Like, how many times do I think about friend X versus how many times does friend X call me? Or you mentioned, I think, specifically a hospice worker thinking about one of their clients. It's like, well, who knows who has a better feeling about when somebody's time is coming than a hospice worker who does this professionally? So, like, they're going to be thinking about their clients just going about their day. I mean, I don't think that would be that rare for a hospice worker. So, eventually, I think that the experience of them thinking about them and then figuring out that they had passed away around that time, I think that just as a statistical likelihood, just with how many hospice workers there are, how many times they think about their clients, and how often their clients pass away, I think that a lot of that could probably be explained just looking at the statistics.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very much because it's something I've gone back and forth in my mind about, like with what Erica was talking about just how the brain works and comforting itself. And for me, a lot of the thing that kind of pulls me back a little is, people talk about ideas of an afterlife and everything. And commonly, I'll hear about like the fear of death or what happens after death. And like for me, it never really was about me, like my existence, so much as the idea of getting to see people again. And so my brain does this like push and pull of logically, I understand, hey, I might have just had a really vivid dream about something I wanted to experience versus that, like, I try to come up with some reason, like, well, it's still kind of her in a way, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think
Mm.
it's really interesting that people don't seem to experience these visitations in any way other than what is overwhelmingly positive, which seems to be what your brain would do if it were trying to sort of comfort itself. You don't tend to get visited by somebody who's like, "Oh my God, hell sucks so much. I'm burning all the time and it's horrible." You tend to be visited by people who are like, "Hey, I want to let you know that I'm okay. Things are doing well. You don't have to worry about me, where I am, or what I'm doing. It's all good." And I think that, that's important too, like what I said earlier, right? Like that helps us in part process what happened, whatever it is that did happen. I find the near death experiences that people tend to report, the ones where it's like, oh, I was floating on over my own body, and from that perspective, I was able to see the room number on the outside, which I couldn't see from the inside, and then I reported back on it once I was there, and it's like I couldn't have possibly known that from where I was, and so that proves that I was in fact, hovering over my own body, and I found those compelling for a while, but I think that humans are really really good at two things that relate to this topic, right? We are incredibly social and we are phenomenal at managing those social relationships. We're so good at that, at managing our social relationships, that we can do it over long distances. We can manage social relationships with people like who aren't even really there, right? Like we form these relationships with fictional stories even, and we feel empathy for fictional characters who aren't even real. You can picture a sad looking dog and feel bad for it, and it's like you just conjured up that entire situation. And then the other thing that we're really good at is recognizing patterns. And oftentimes we recognize patterns without even realizing that we're recognizing patterns. And they can actually end up saving our lives. So the book called The Gift of Fear outlines this really well, where it's like we tend to pick up on these little clues that send shivers down our spine, or make us feel uneasy in certain situations. And then we act on those feelings without even understanding why we feel that way. And it ends up saving us in the long run. You're walking down an alley and you feel like you're being watched, and so you hustle to your car, and it's like that saves you from being mugged or something like that. Um, the psychology behind this is super interesting. It's not like you're picking up on nothing. Your brain is picking up on subtle clues. Maybe you heard something just out of reach, like it felt like somebody was maybe walking behind you, or you saw the reflection of the muzzle of a gun or something on a nearby gutter, and it's like you don't even know that you recognize it, but your brain processes it into a feeling of unease, and then you act on that feeling. And that goes way back to hominins that hear a little rustle in the grass, and it's like, well, it may be nothing, but reacting when it's nothing doesn't hurt you. not reacting when it's something gets you killed, right? So it's like this tendency to see these patterns, like put two and two together, combined with our sociality, I think a lot of the time causes these near death experiences, or these post death experiences or shared death experiences. In my mind, the way that I sort of understand this to hash out is that it's like we're picking up on a lot of these clues. A hospice worker, who works with a client for a really long time, and they really enjoy this client, they like them, they're close with them, and they pick up on these subtle clues, that maybe they're close to death, even if they don't even realize it, right? Like they're less talkative than normal, or they're sweating more than usual, or whatever. And then it's like, oh, I had this weird feeling that maybe this was their last day, and then they ended up dying. And it's like, well, you weren't necessarily seeing into the future. You might have just been picking up on clues without even realizing it. And I think that that's a really important thing that we have to factor into when we're talking about explaining something using Occam's razor, or appealing to something like, this was a near death experience, this was a shared death experience, this was a post death experience. And the only way to explain it is with a supernatural explanation that can't be standardized or really investigated. That's my little monologue.
I have two quick things. Well, I don't know if they'll be quick. Sorry, but two things to say on that. I think it actually goes. Maybe like I do think that pattern recognition is a huge part of it, but I think that there's also, and you touched on this. There's an intersection between unconscious and conscious, where you can maybe unconsciously have picked up on something that you didn't even consciously were aware of, that then can come to your conscious attention, and your brain almost tells you a story about how and why that doesn't necessarily have to be based in reality at all. The example that I'll pull from is like the split brain studies that they'll do. So they'll have these patients whose hemispheres have been surgically separated because they were like having seizures or something. And so their right hemisphere and their left hemisphere will be essentially functioning independently almost. And their conscious awareness will be associated with one of the hemispheres, and the other hemisphere can sometimes control like a hand or something. So they'll be like picking out clothes that they want to wear in the morning, and like their other hand will just grab an outfit, and they'll be like, "No, I don't want to wear that today," and like the hand will be like trying to put it on them, and like it's like stuff like that gets really strange. It makes you wonder about the nature of consciousness. But for these patients, sometimes they will show them a cue, like a picture of a hammer or like the word hammer, and they'll show it in a way that it's in the field of vision that only the hemisphere that's outside of their conscious awareness is seeing it. They can't see it consciously. You ask them, "What did we just show you?" They said a blank screen. They didn't see anything, but the other hemisphere of their brain saw the word hammer. And so then they'll give them a pencil and a piece of paper, and they'll ask the hand that corresponds to that hemisphere, "Draw what you saw." And they will draw a picture of a hammer. And then they'll ask them, "Why did you draw a hammer?" And they'll make up a story that they believe. They believe that this is really why they drew a hammer, but they don't understand that the reason why they drew the hammer is because they unconsciously saw the cue hammer. But when you ask them consciously, "Why did you draw the hammer?" they'll say, "Oh, well, when I came to the experiment today, I walked past a house that reminded me of a house that I used to work on as a kid, and it reminded me of hammers." Like they will have an entire narrative that they genuinely think is the truth, but in reality, the experimenters know why they drew a hammer. And I think that this kind of process goes on all the times in our lives, where there's things that sort of cross over from unconscious information to consciously aware, like information we're consciously aware of. And the brain has to create some sort of narrative reason that makes sense to our, subjective experience for why that happened. And I think a lot of these things fall into that category of tricks that your brain plays on you.
I think
And
I
oh,
think if you
sorry.
were going to summarize it, right? Like I feel like if you were going to summarize it, it would be like, okay, these experiences where you feel like you're visited post death might be the brain attempting to rationalize grief, to process grief, to comfort itself. And these near death or post death experiences may be effectively your present self putting two and two together of all of these separate clues that your brain has picked up over the past several days, weeks, months, and it's the only way that your conscious brain can rationalize it, because you weren't sort of noticing every time you were picking up these clues, is okay, well, maybe it's supernatural, right? You're creating a pattern out of a bunch of smaller clues that you've sort of picked up along the way. And I feel like both of those explanations together make better sense of the data that we have from all of these sort of death and death adjacent experiences, in part because these death and death adjacent experiences don't tend to have like an empirical through line that characterizes all of them, right? They're always very personalized to the individual that's experiencing them, which to me suggests that the brain is probably what's at play here rather than the supernatural. But that's just my opinion.
And sorry, I said I had two things to say, and then I only said one long thing. The second thing, which is much shorter, is, and this is just what I feel like oftentimes I come across with people that want to believe in the supernatural. It's not necessarily that they have all this evidence or whatever, or they know for a fact. They really want to believe that there's more than just the natural world around us. Because oftentimes I feel like, and I don't feel this way, but I see other people sometimes, they're thinking that's it. It's all just the natural world. There's nothing supernatural. And they're almost disappointed or bored by this explanation. And when you explain things about statistics or heuristics or neuroscience, that's boring. And they want to live in a world that's exciting. They want to live in a world that has UFOs and Bigfoot and God and angels, and that, what an exciting world to live in that has all these crazy supernatural things. So they're like inherently biasing themselves even before they've even looked at the world around them or the evidence. They desperately want it to be true because they feel like they'll just be disappointed in reality if it's not. And that is just, I think that's super common. And that's like one of the biggest things that just impedes your ability to decipher the world around you, is like you wanting it to be a certain way before you look.
Yeah, that
What do you make
very
of all
much
that, Sam?
sounds like a lot of what I grew up with, because I went to very conservative schools growing up. I grew up young Earth creationist. I promise I'm
Mhm.
not anymore.
Classic.
Uh,
Classic.
but but there was always this emphasis on, like, they would talk about God's design and how wonderful it is and stuff, and like really try to portray it as, oh, but if you see it as all just natural, it loses that luster. Essentially, they always portray the parts of God's design as being way more interesting. And a, a like thought stopper I had to fight for a long time was a prayer they taught that was like, Lord, I believe, help me overcome my unbelief.
Oh my
Hmm.
god.
I've heard that one.
And yeah, and so it's something that's been very hard to fight against, because like I'll fully admit that is a lot of it is there's just that internal desire that was ingrained into me of wanting it to be more, wanting there to be other things, to be an afterlife, etc.
And let me just tell you, Sam, because I come from kind of the opposite background, to where I was never raised like in religion, basically. So for me, I never had that, and I never had that idea kind of instilled into me that if the world is just this, then it's somehow lesser than. And just from my perspective, when I look around and I see the world around us, like I can guarantee that I am experiencing no less awe, no less wonder, no less overcome with like the majesty of how beautiful everything in this universe can be than a theist would be. Like there's, if anything, I don't know. I can very much appreciate the beauty of the world around us. I don't think it's lessened at all one iota by the fact that there's no God. So, I really do think that this is like a belief that is taught, that they want, they try to instill this into people, that like, even if there might be rational reasons not to believe, you don't want to live in a world where there's no God, because just can you imagine how depressing that would be? And they try to like layer on all these negative emotions to associate with it, so that like even if the rationality and the evidence starts to make you lead that way, the negative emotions act like this barrier to keep you from following that rational instinct.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think I think it's almost condescending to the the majesty of nature, right? Like the fact that we end up with so much beauty and complexity in the world around us, and the fact that it's so rigged, right? Like the whole thing is so like duct taped together. Excuse me, from the hiccup. That's a great example, right? Like the fact that humans hiccup at all is actually a very ancient leftover from the instinct that what extant animals like mud skippers do when they come up out of the water and they sort of do that gasping reflex, right? Like the hiccuping is the way that we try to get our diaphragm to go back into the OG position, because we've changed so much morphologically since that state that we have this little vestigial quirk that we get hiccups because our diaphragm won't auto correct itself. We don't have manual control over it anymore. So it's like every aspect of us is duct taped together in this wonderful way that is so coherent and works so well because of the way that natural selection um, functions in the natural world, right? And that's what gives the illusion of complexity, not the illusion of complexity, the illusion of design, right? And you could talk all day about like the puddle analogy, how it's like, oh, water is water in a puddle, right, in a pothole or something like that, is accommodating the whole. The whole isn't accommodating the water. If that makes sense. But yeah, like I remember growing up very similar to how you did, Sam, where it's like, yeah, how could anybody think that the eye is not designed, right? It simply must require a designer. And then it's like, well, the retina is on backwards, right? Or the cornea or the retina can detach, or the cornea is easily scratched and can't repair itself as quickly as other parts of the eye. It's like there are a million different reasons that you can point to that's like, no, this seems like the product of a very long, convoluted process that is in its entirety responsible for the biodiversity that we see today and the structures of the organisms that inhabit it. And there's a beauty and a wonder to that I think people denigrate when they insist that it requires someone, not just a designer, but a designer like us, right? A designer who would do it our way instead of the way that it's managed to sort of seamlessly result in the diversity that we have today. It's really done an excellent job of keeping life up and kicking for the past 4.2 billion years, depending on which study you go with. But I empathize, is what I'm trying to say.
I understand. And I kind of, as I was listening to you two, realized a bit of where some of my position kind of comes from in terms of my background. I mean, I always was an inquisitive kid. I asked a lot of questions, and that made Bible teachers very annoyed. Uh, and so there was always that little bit of questioning things. But, I was very steeped in it, and essentially cult like mentality of, if you go to a public school, they're going to ridicule you and you're not going to have friends, and the outside
Yeah.
world is scary kind of thing. And
Well,
but
there's a
as I
persecution complex that's so odd, isn't there? Right? Like they act like, I remember being showed like propaganda and stuff like that at my creationist middle school. That's like, oh, when you go to a public school or when you go into the real world, you're going to have to defend your faith with the sword of the spirit, because the evolutionists are going to come after you. And then it's like the evolutionists in question are like some dork with glasses who are like, isn't biology amazing? And it's like, it's just not that serious.
right,
I'll say that
exactly. Like,
also, this is a common technique that a lot of cults do, like smaller cults as well. They will try to ingrain in their members this us versus them mentality, where them is the entire outside world that's all against the in group of the cult. And it makes you suspicious of the outside world because you and your in group, you're the ones that are leading the correct life with the correct knowledge, worshiping the correct God, and everyone else is fallen. It's a fallen world. And it primes you to be more skeptical of science, because science comes from that fallen outside world. It is not to be trusted if it's telling you something that's different than your in group. And this is what cults do. And religions, I don't know who's borrowing from whose playbook. Let's say there's a lot of overlap.
Well, the difference between
Yeah,
religion and a cult is a fine line, isn't it? Right? Like if you look at the criteria that we outline for a cult, right? It's almost like looking at the difference between microevolution and macroevolution, isn't it?
It's a difference of scale.
It's a difference of scale. That's it.
yeah, and it's funny because, this wasn't completely foreign to me and my friends in school. Like, we would joke sometimes about being in a cult, which I feel like in retrospect was maybe a coping mechanism for being in a cult.
It's a big red
Uh,
flag. It's a big red flag.
but, I meet people from the outside world and, my worldview is completely shattered. Like, wow, everyone's really friendly and is offering to teach me things and like just really excited about this stuff. And there began this push pull of like, I didn't want to let go of the Christianity, but I knew I couldn't stick with that Christianity. And so I kind of hung around more like liberal Christianity for a long time. And
Yeah, and like
it,
I don't know. I've always been extremely friendly towards the sort of more liberal, progressive, science affirming religious folks, just because it's like, we tend to agree on the stuff that matters to me. And then it's like the more fringe stuff, right? You end up having conversations with people, okay, like, why do you believe? And it tends to be like, well, I've got a feeling, or, well, I want to believe, or whatever. And being a huge geek, to me, the second that it takes a step out of what we can investigate using science, I tend to just not care as much. Like there are great debaters out there who can sort of logic their way through, why they're an atheist or an agnostic or whatever. I'm not one of those people, so I tend to just be like, "Yay! I'm glad we both accept science." But at the same time, there are reasons why I hold the position why I hold, right? And it's like things like divine hiddenness and the problem of evil, and all of these pretty big philosophical questions that even when I was sort of a more liberal Christian, sort of itched at the back of my brain and made me uncomfortable the more I thought about them. And matters were made worse when it's like you have those conversations with other people who do believe, and you find the answers unsatisfactory, and then that tends to sort of kick you down the water slide, as it were.
I think I
yeah,
also have, sorry about that. I just have a different
no worries.
perspective on that about why I'm an atheist because, I was an atheist since I was like a toddler, way before I could have ever thought about something like the problem of evil or divine hiddenness. Like, the reason I think I've been an atheist my whole life is just because I've never had a sufficient reason to believe, whether that's a logical reason or an empirical one with evidence. Like, usually, if I'm going to believe something, I need a good reason to do so, right? I mean, I think that that's only fair. And my whole life, I've never been provided with a sufficient reason to believe that God or the supernatural exists. So that is also a challenge to anyone listening. Freaking call in if you've got a reason. Like, I'm here, I've got open ears, I'm waiting to hear it. Show us what you got.
Grayson, no, we have almost full lines now. we're good on no more goading the chat.
Okay. Well, then just ignore
I
everything
kid.
that I said.
No, I kid. Call in if you want to prove God to us, you should do it. But like Sam, I think it's totally cool and fine to read about near death experiences and post death experiences and whatever peri death experiences and be like, this is weird, right? Like I'm never gonna get up here and be like, oh, you can just write off near death experiences or UFOs or whatever, Bigfoot, and be like, everybody who thinks they've seen them is a dummy or gullible or whatever, right? Like the human brain is really, really good at, again, finding patterns and also tricking itself. And we all fall victim to that in different ways, right? So, when people say they see something weird, that's super interesting because while my first inkling is like, okay, well, there's a rational explanation for it, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it, right? I mean, you only have to see real Bigfoot once, and I'm just champing at the bit for the first person who finally comes up with a Bigfoot corpse and is like, look, I actually got it this time. So there's no problem with asking these kinds of questions and sort of puzzling through them and bringing them up to other people and saying like, look, what do you think about this? and just kind of hashing it out. I mean, I think that shows that you're a super inquisitive person.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what my teachers said growing up. I had a lot of questions, and I definitely got a lot of the, God's ways are higher than ours, etc. And that really
Mm.
did always kind of not sit right with me, but at the same time, I kind of just learned, well, okay, if I ask these questions, they're just not going to answer. So,
I mean, me either, right? And the way that I always rationalize it, it's like, okay, well, God supposedly made humans in His image, and that image, even when I was taught at a young Earth creationist middle school, right? Like they didn't teach that that image was literal, right? It was more like, oh, you're spiritual, you can reason, while the animals can't, stuff like that. And I always kind of thought to myself, okay, well, God's reasons are higher than mine, but like if I'm made in his image, like aren't I justified in trying to puzzle through that? Aren't I justified in asking that question? Right? Didn't he know that when he sort of tinkered me together in the little workshop in the clouds, right? And I was always discouraged from asking those types of questions too, which irritated me as a youngster.
oh yeah, very much the same. And it ironically kind of helped in a way in that I eventually, because that inquisitiveness never went away. So I eventually, the thing I always point to as like starting was I read The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins, which like
That's a really
I'm not
great
a,
book.
yeah. And I always tell people, I'm like, listen, I know what you're thinking when you hear the name Richard Dawkins. It's nothing to do with God existing or anything. It really was something like it was the first time I read through and really thought, oh, I actually kind of understand what evolution is.
Nice.
Well, and you are not the only person in that position, right? Like evolution education here in the United States, and you're calling from the United States, so it's like you're in the same boat as the rest of us. Unfortunately, it's abysmal. We do not prepare students to understand how evolution works. We barely prepare them to understand the basics of cell biology or levels of ecological systems, ecological communities, right? Let alone what evolution is and how it works. And that's why it's so compelling to some people to hear these arguments from design. Like, well, just look at the trees, right? They're too complex. How could they have emerged on their own? And it's like, tell me you don't know the mechanisms of evolution without telling me you don't know the mechanisms of evolution. So taking that step and being an autodidact and trying to teach this stuff to yourself, since the education system has failed you, um, has hopefully served you well. And I'm not surprised to hear that it was like mind blowing to read about evolution for the first time, because I felt the same way. Like when I was like first leafing through this textbook, this hand me down textbook that we got at my middle school, I was like, wait, oh, this makes a lot of sense. Hold on, what's wrong with this? This seems like
Exactly.
it really works. Like,
Yeah, it's funny how often I'll run into something and find it like, why wasn't I ever taught about any of this? Like,
yup,
first of all,
yeah.
I listen to your videos at work. Basically, everything I know about hominin evolution is from
Oh
you. So
yes. Who's your favorite hominin? What's your favorite hominin? I should say.
I right now, I was joking with friends. I'm like, I went from having no idea what a Homo naledi is to being emotionally invested in the Homo naledi.
That's awesome. I actually had some students this semester who were like, "Thank you so much for like getting me involved in like the messy bitches of paleoanthropology and like the tea that can be spilled about like the these kind of esoteric fossil sites that people like to argue about and stake their entire careers on." And it's like, yeah, humans are human. We make everything interesting. And as we move into the past, it's no exception. I mean, it would have been really fun to explain to a member of Homo naledi like how problematic their little body dumping site has become in the present. My opinion, I guess I should say, that it's a body dumping site because it probably is. But don't totally broker that.
Wait, Erica,
Thank you
what's
so
your
much for
favorite
calling,
hominid?
Sam. Oh, everybody knows my favorite hominin. My favorite hominin is Ardipithecus ramidus. I'm a big sucker for anything that is gibbon-esque. And Ardipithecus is like a large gibbon, which I absolutely think is the cool. I would have loved to meet Ardipithecus. I think it would have been the coolest thing in the world. So I love their weird feet. I love their big canines for hominin. I love the fact that they were little, again, moving, applying social categories using sexual dimorphism. I love the fact that they're probably pair bonded. And I love the fact that they're hominins, even though they're probably not ancestral to Australopithecus. Like they're Paranthropus, but earlier. Not the ancestor of Paranthropus, but being like a weird sister group in the way that Paranthropus is, I should specify. So those guys are my favorite. Tim White notwithstanding, not letting anybody touch the fossils, but it's fine. Sam, thank you so much for calling in. We got a bunch of other calls to get to, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that if nothing else, you kind of got to air your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, you two definitely gave me a lot of things to think about and read up on and kind of ruminate on for a bit.
Oh, awesome. Perfect. Well, don't hesitate to call back if you think of anything else that you want to chat about next time we're on. You have one of these experiences for yourself where you look into them and you find them compelling, call back, and maybe you'll convince us.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for talking with
Thanks,
me.
my friend. Take care.
And like a subscriber, Jimmy will have to go on a polyamorous dating show to win some prize money.
Wait, I want to do that. So also hit like and subscribe, and then go to patreon.com/calltheline. I was trying to make you laugh and ruin the take. That's why that silly face earlier. If I was on a polyamorous dating show, I would just choose everybody. Except Frederick. Leave a comment.